Hello, welcome to Capturing Christianity. I am Cameron Bertuzzi, and today I'm joined by Dr. Craig, Dr. William Lane Craig, none other than Dr. Craig, and we're talking about a video that was posted by Rationality Rules. He's actually a friend of mine at this point. I would call him a friend, Stephen Woodford. He posted a video entitled, well, I actually don't know the exact title of it. I probably should know that, but it was a video debunking theism in 15 minutes. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to respond to some of the things that Stephen says. And I want to say at the very beginning of this, is that I realized that he even has a trigger warning, and we're gonna play that video right at the beginning of this, is that he was not trying to be super serious in the video that he produced. So we're going to try to keep that in mind as we're going through this response video. With that in mind, it's like he wasn't trying to produce some kind of like academic disproof of these arguments. It was kind of like more something fun is what he calls it. We'll get into that in just a minute, but Dr. Craig, it's great to have you back on the show.
Thanks, Cameron. Good to be with you again.
Great. Yeah. And if you'd like to learn more about Dr. Craig, then go visit his website, reasonablefaith.org. I've got it linked in the description of this video. I've also got Stephen's video linked in the description of this video if you'd like to go check that out. But without further ado, we're going to go ahead and jump right in and play the first clip. And as I mentioned, Dr. Craig, if you'd like to stop and say anything throughout these clips, then just let me know and I will pause it, and then we'll make comments and then keep going. So here we go. Here's the first clip.
First of all, however, I have to put down a trigger warning for theists, you see, because there is no way that I could possibly, in any possible world, address every defense of every premise for every argument for God's existence in 14 minutes. And so just chill, we're having a good time. This is meant to just be a bit of fun. And that also goes out to our friendly neighborhood agnostic, Joe Schmid. I don't want to see a 40,000 essay, Joe, okay? Just chill.
So first of all, do you know Joe Schmid?
I know his work. He's written some things on divine simplicity with Ryan Mullins that is quite good, and so I have appreciated his work.
Excellent. So do you have any thoughts on this clip, this introductory clip here on this trigger warning for theists in this video?
Yeah, this should equally be for atheists too, I think, Cameron. He says we're just going to have some fun. At the end of the video, he says, I'm just being a little facetious. I know I can't refute all the theistic arguments in 15 minutes, but I fear that some atheist may mistakenly think that he's done that. And I'm sure that he thinks that his criticisms are sound criticisms. And so I think it is fair to respond to him and point out their manifold shortcomings.
I appreciate that. All right, let's get into the second clip here. Here we go. And as I mentioned, feel free to stop me at any point.
All right.
Let's start with everyone's favorite argument for God. And if this isn't your favorite argument for God, then you're wrong. It's the argument that asserts that if you can think of it, it's real. I call it the imagination game, but you may know it as the ontological argument. Allow me to demonstrate. I have produced here for you the greatest possible presentation. If this, the greatest possible presentation, did not exist, then you could produce a greater possible presentation. But you cannot produce a greater possible presentation than this, the greatest possible presentation. Hence, this is the greatest possible presentation. Checkmate.
All right, let's stop it there, Cameron. I think he has really caricatured the ontological argument. It is not based upon your ability to imagine that God exists. And so imagining the greatest possible presentation, or he'll give some other parodies later, are not at all analogous to the ontological argument. A little bit later, I'll put up the actual premises of the ontological argument. The argument is based upon the possibility that there is a maximally great being, one that is omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and necessarily existent. And it's not just a matter of imagination. It's a matter of what you think is possible.
Metaphysically possible.
Yes.
All right, here we go. We'll continue.
You see, the ontological argument treats existence as if it's an attribute, and then reasons that God must have this attribute since he is, by definition, the greatest possible being. Yes, I know this is philosophical masturbation at its finest. Objections. So there was this guy called Guanilo, and Guanilo existed at the same time.
Pause there. Can we put up the actual premises of the ontological argument in the form that Alvin Plantinga defines it?
Sure. Just give me a second. Give me a second to put it up on this screen. I'm just
okay.
Wasn't prepared to put it on this one, but I can. Here we go.
This is how the argument actually goes. It's possible that a maximally great being called God exists, where maximal greatness is defined as omniscience, omnipotence, moral perfection, and necessary existence. 2, if it is possible that a maximally great being exists, then a maximally great being exists in some possible world. 3, if a maximally great being exists in some possible worlds, then it exists in every possible world. 4, if a maximally great being exists in every possible world, then it exists in the actual world. 5, therefore, a maximally great being exists in the actual world. 6, therefore, a maximally great being exists, and therefore God exists. This is how the strongest modal versions of the ontological argument go. What he's attacking in the video is an extremely weak version of the ontological argument, and his criticisms of that simply don't apply to these modal formulations of the argument.
All right, we'll continue the video.
He was Anselm. He was a contemporary of Anselm. And what he did is he went, look, bro, we can just replace the word the greatest possible being, the term the greatest possible being, with the greatest possible island. And then we're going to have the greatest possible island. If you now think of an island and it's perfect for you, you're thinking it's got cookies, it's got Seth Andrews narrating your life, whatever it might be, but you don't have existence as part of the island's definition, then, well, I can think of a greater island, namely the one that you've just described, but with the addition of existence. It's better to exist than not exist. That's the general thrust, of course, and it works just as much for island. It also works for an evil being. The greatest possible evil being would be one that necessarily exists. And if you read the Bible, I actually think that evil being is a better description of God than a good being. Or this is my favorite one. We can say that we can conceive of the worst possible argument, and quite frankly, the ontological argument competes for that. May even be it. We can, if we like,
all right, let's pause it again.
There's only 10 seconds left, so I might as well just, I'll switch over to our regular screen.
Okay, because he still has his criticism from Kant left, but what he's providing here are parodies of the ontological argument, where you apply it to things like a presentation, an evil being, an island, and so forth, and try to show that if the ontological argument is sound, then you would prove these other things as well. And the problem with these parodies is that they posit incoherencies. There is no such thing as a greatest possible island. An island isn't the sort of thing that has intrinsic great-making properties. These are relative to your interests. Do you prefer an island that is a desert island with palm trees, or do you prefer to have an island that's chock full of first-rate resort hotels? There isn't any objective great-making properties for greatness of islands. Similarly, with respect to an evil being, it is, I think, metaphysically impossible for there to be a greatest conceivable evil being, because a greatest conceivable being has as one of its properties moral perfection. And in the absence of God, there wouldn't even be any sort of standard to define objective moral values. Similarly, there isn't any such thing as the worst possible argument. If an argument is logically invalid and has false premises, then that's as worst as it can get. And there just is no such thing as the worst possible argument. So these attempts to have parodies just show that the person offering them hasn't really grasped the concept of God as a maximally great being, and ask the question, is it possible that such a being exists?
And would it be helpful to put that slide back up on the screen, or do you think that we're good on that end?
You mean the one with Plantinga's formulation?
Sure.
Or, yeah, if you want, for our viewers so that they could see what we're talking about. This is Alvin Plantinga's formulation of the ontological argument. And the key premise in this argument is, number one, the remaining premises are just deductions and aren't really in dispute. The only disputable premise is, number one, do you think it's possible that God exists? If you think it's possible that God exists, then it follows logically that God does exist by this argument. And the attempts to parody it offer things that are not metaphysically possible. In fact, things like a maximally worst argument or a maximally great evil being and things of this sort. What we would do in the cases of arguments like that is deny the first premise. In fact, it is not possible that something like a worst possible argument exists. That's an incoherent notion. But with respect to premise one of Plantinga's argument, it does seem intuitively obvious that it's possible for a being who is omnipotent, omniscient, morally perfect, and necessarily existent to exist. And if that is a coherent concept, then it follows that God does exist.
So why don't you now talk about the Kantian objection? I know we're not going to play the clip from him. It's only 10 seconds long, but
all right.
We'll go ahead and address the Kantian objection.
Yeah, in his remaining clip, he says existence is not a property. It's not a great-making property. And contemporary versions of the ontological argument don't assume that existence is a property. It just asks whether it's possible that there be a being that answers to this concept of maximal greatness. And certainly to exist in every possible world is greater than to just exist in some but not all worlds. And so even if existence is not a property, it doesn't have any effect upon Plantinga's formulation of the argument.
So at this point, I'd like to steelman Stephen's argument. And instead of focusing on parodies or these Kantian objections, what about the reverse modal ontological argument that says it's possible that God does not exist?
Oh, yes, that is exactly what our viewers need to decide. That's the first premise. If it is possible that God not exist, then it follows that God does not exist. So you need to ask yourself, do you think it's possible that God exists or not? And that is exactly the first premise. And I'm persuaded that this is possible and that therefore the argument is sound. Remember, as you pointed out, Cameron, we're talking about metaphysical possibility here, not merely epistemic possibility. Someone might think, well, it's possible that he exists. It's possible that he doesn't exist. But we're not talking about possibility in that epistemic sense. Imagine some complex mathematical equation in front of you, and you don't know whether it's true or not. You could say, well, it's possible it's true, it's possible it's not true. But this mathematical equation, if it's possibly true, is necessarily true. And if it's possibly false, it's necessarily false. So when you talk in terms of metaphysical necessity or possibility, it's not a matter of our epistemic uncertainty. If it's possible, then it's necessary. And that's similar with respect to the case of God.
All right, let's move on to the next clip. And this one is on the cosmological argument. And there's two clips in that one, but again, feel free to pause me as we go along here.
Cosmological argument. When Thomists employ this argument, or indeed anything from Summa Theologia, they tend to insist on potentially wrapping their actual being of an argument in potential actualization for mysterious actual potential, but we ain't going to do this because we are Anglais. Capiche? Here it is in a nutshell. Premise 1. Everything that exists has a cause. Premise 2. The universe exists. Conclusion.
All right, let's stop it right now at the end of this argument. This is a formulation of the cosmological argument that no one has defended. No theist believes that everything that exists has a cause. That would require that there be a cause of God. So what we've got here is, again, a caricature of the argument. This is not correctly formulated. Let's put up a formulation of the contingency argument that is one that theists have defended.
All right, just working on it now. Again, we're kind of putting these in a place where I didn't have prepared, but this is totally okay. Here we go.
Okay, here's a version of the argument that I've defended based upon a formulation by Stephen Davis. Premise 1, everything that exists has an explanation of its existence. And this might either be in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. Premise 2 is that the universe exists. 3, if the universe has an explanation of its existence, then that explanation is an external, transcendent, and personal cause. And 4, therefore, the explanation of the existence of the universe is an external, transcendent, personal cause. Now, we won't go into the defense of all of these premises, but I think you can see that these premises are quite different than the ones that Stephen offers in his caricature. There's a difference between having a cause and having an explanation. And the premise that is correct is that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, which might be either a cause, an external cause, or the necessity of its own nature.
I've got a challenge for Stephen. I'd like him to show us who defends that first premise. Like, show us a theist in the literature that has defended that first premise, this version of this argument, because I don't think he's going to find it.
He ascribes it to Thomas Aquinas, which is just completely false.
Okay, let's keep going through the video.
Has a cause. Proponents defend the first premise via inductive reasoning. They say, look, every existing thing we know of has a cause, and so we can assume that, probably, all existing things have a cause. They dress this up in Bayesian language normally as well. That's becoming quite popular in apologetic circles. So how do we respond to this? There's so many ways. Here's one. We can just point out that this is a black swan fallacy. For millennia, it was universally accepted that all swans are white. In fact, this truth was so incontrovertible that logicians would often use it to illustrate the process of deductive reasoning. Yes, all existing things seem to have a cause, but maybe in certain conditions there's a black swan. There is existing things that don't have causes. Maybe. But fair enough, the intuition is still pretty strong, so we'll try a different objection. What about this? We could say, no, everything that exists has an explanation, but not necessarily a cause. A cause is a very specific type of explanation. If I had 12 apples and I wanted to hand out one apple to every single person that was in that crowd, I couldn't do it because there was more than 12. Thus, the explanation obviously had nothing to do with causation at all. Likewise, if we asked, why is there something rather than nothing, the big Leibniz question, and we answered it by saying that it's because nothing is a human abstract, and thus it's not possible, then we have an explanation for existing things that is not a cause.
Okay, let's stop there. Here he himself recognizes the distinction between an explanation and a cause, which is why his caricature of the argument is incorrect. The correct premise is that everything that exists has an explanation of its existence, and that might be a cause, or it might be that the thing exists by a necessity of its own nature. And so Stephen himself, I think, undermines his critique by recognizing this important distinction between an explanation and a cause.
My favorite ways to approach it. We could just bite the bullet and say, fair enough. But what this means is that God, being an existing thing, has a cause. Just follows. To which theists respond, no, God is special. The problem, however, is that any reason they give for God's speciality can be applied with fewer assumptions and fewer ontological commitments to the universe itself. For instance, if they say that God is...
Did you want to pause?
Remember, I said in the first premise that anything that exists has an explanation of its existence, either in the necessity of its own nature or in an external cause. So the claim is that God's explanation is that he exists by a necessity of his own nature. Now, the atheist can reply to that, well, the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature, but then we are right in the midst of the contingency argument. Is the universe necessarily existent? I think hardly anyone thinks that the universe is a metaphysically necessary being. And especially the next argument we'll discuss, the one that is based on the beginning of the universe, seems to show very clearly that the universe is contingent. And therefore, this explanation for God's existence doesn't apply to the universe itself.
All right, we've got about 17 seconds left in this clip.
Unlimited in power, we can say that the universe is unlimited in power. If they say that God is necessary, we can say that the universe is necessary, and again, with fewer ontological commitments. Hence, their special pleading for God. They're asserting that God is an exception to a rule without adequate justification.
All right,
well,
do you have any other
this
thoughts?
This is the heart of the debate. Can they plausibly maintain that the universe exists by a necessity of its own nature? I think that's highly implausible.
Okay, I think we're actually ready to move on to the next clip. We're going pretty quickly here, and if we have time, we are going to do some Q&A with Dr. Craig on either these clips or these arguments. So if you'd like, you can put your questions in the live chat now, but I can't guarantee that we're going to get to all of them. If you send it as a super chat, I can't even guarantee that we're going to get to it then. So we'll see how far we can get and see if we can have time for some questions. We've got about a total of an hour with Dr. Craig. So here is the next clip here. This is where he focuses on the Kalam cosmological argument.
Now, given this problem of special pleading, theists had a great idea. They thought, instead of saying that everything that exists has a cause, how about we just say that everything that begins to exist has a cause? Then they've got their second premise, the universe began to exist, and their conclusion, therefore the universe has a cause.
All right, let's stop it here. Now, at least this time, he has correctly formulated the argument, you notice. So the question will be, are there good reasons to think that these premises are true? And I think you'll find in the forthcoming clip, he doesn't say anything to dispute premise one, that everything that begins to exist. His critique will be aimed at the arguments in support of premise two.
Of course. Where to start? Okay, proponents tend to defend the first premise by arguing for the impossibility of actual infinites. For instance, the Islamic scholar Al-Ghazali emphasized that if the universe had existed forever, then despite Saturn taking 30 times longer than the Earth to orbit the Sun, both have completed the same number of orbits. Infinite. And in recent years, William Lane Craig has expressed these same absurdities through the prism of Hilbert's Hotel. It's the same argument, just more abstract. All right, let's get to objections, because I am well and truly running out of time. Al-Ghazali's rotations and Hilbert's Hotel are simply vertical paradoxes. They produce results that seem absurd, but nevertheless are true. It's like the Monty Hall problem. They work against our intuitions. Any set with Cantor's property is going to yield unintuitive results. And once you wrap your head around set theory, these absurdities are simply not a problem. Infinite sets have weird properties. Get over it, like the overwhelming majority.
Okay, let's stop it right there. Infinite sets have weird properties, so just get over it. That question here for us, Cameron, is going to be, can you translate infinite set theory into reality without metaphysical absurdity? And my argument would be that however consistent infinite set theory is, given its axioms and definitions, that if you try to instantiate it in reality, as examples like Hilbert's Hotel and Al-Ghazali's illustration of Jupiter and Saturn orbiting from eternity past, it has results that I think are plausibly metaphysically absurd. And I think it's simply too dismissive to just say, get over it. The question is, how weird, how counterintuitive do these situations have to get before you recognize that, in fact, these are metaphysically impossible? Suppose I were to say to you that something has a size but doesn't have a shape. And you would say, well, that's metaphysically impossible. Everything that has a size has a shape. And I say, no, just get over it. Or I say the prime minister is a prime number. And you say, well, that's metaphysically impossible. I say, well, just get over it. Or I say gold could have had a different atomic number than 79. There's no logical inconsistency in that. And you say, well, it's impossible that gold could have had a different atomic number than 79. And I just say, well, get over it. You see, you can say, just get over it about any of these metaphysically impossible situations. And I don't think that that really solves the problem. That's just far too easy, far too dismissive. I think that when you really think about what it would be like to have an actually infinite number of things, it is very plausible to think that this is metaphysically impossible. And it's just too easy to say, just get over it.
Yeah, and I have to apologize to Stephen. These clips that we're like pausing and stuff, like you've got these faces that he's making and stuff, and it's not very flattering. But sorry about that, Stephen. So I did want to ask you a question, because related to this it seems to me like you, in your conversation that you had with Cosmic Skeptic, you talked about the intellectual price tag of atheism. And I think that can kind of play a role here, is that if you want to say that it's metaphysically possible that these absurdities, could exist, it seems to if anything, if it's not metaphysically impossible, it nevertheless still raises the intellectual price tag of atheism. Maybe that's one way of looking at it.
Exactly. That's exactly right, Cameron. If the atheist is going to just bite the bullet and say, I just affirm that you can have a hotel that is fully occupied and yet can accommodate infinitely new guests, I think you've considerably raised the price of atheism. So you're exactly right there. These arguments aren't coercive, but they certainly raise the price tag that the atheist has to pay for his skepticism.
All right, let's continue through the video.
And philosophers have. Now, another prominent defense of this premise in recent years has come from Alex Proust, Robert Koons, and Josh Rasmussen. And what they are saying is that causal finitism is true. Causal finitism is the thesis that nothing can have an infinite causal history. Or in other words, there cannot be infinitely many causes affecting one target state, substance, or event. And to illustrate this, a priori, no less, from an armchair, theists will employ supposed paradoxes such as the grim messenger paradox. We haven't the time to be able to get into any of these paradoxes. I'm running out of time completely. But because the grim messenger paradox is their choice weapon, it's the one that they put forward, we can just simply point out that it is not, in fact, a paradox, but rather a logical inconsistency. It's just difficult to recognize it. If you need more help on this, watch my debate with Cameron Bertuzzi. I spell it out, and I go deeply into the works of Nicholas Schickel.
All right, let's make clear for our viewers what the Grim Reaper paradox is. Imagine that you're alive at midnight, but there is a Grim Reaper who will cut you down at 1 a.m. if you live that long. But there's a second Grim Reaper who will cut you down at 12:30 if you live that long. But then there's a third Grim Reaper who will cut you down at 12:15 if you live that long, ad infinitum. The result of this situation is that it is logically impossible for you to live past midnight, and yet it is impossible that you be killed by any Grim Reaper, because before anyone could cut you down, you would already be dead. And so what Proust's argument shows is that if you can have an actually infinite number of things, it results not simply in metaphysical impossibility, but in a strict logical impossibility where you would be both dead and alive.
Yeah, and there's been responses to this, and I actually did a debate with Stephen, and so I recommend, if you're interested in this objection, this argument, then go watch our debate, Go watch the back and forth, because there's some objections that he raises that I think are actually really good, and they're based on some other objections that have been raised by Alex Malpass and other philosophers. So really, really interesting exchange. If you're interested, go check out our debate, and I think he references it as well. But let's get to the last clip. We're actually going really quickly. Go ahead.
Funny. One last comment is that he tries to have his cake and eat it too. When it comes to things like Hilbert's Hotel and Al-Ghazali's orbits, he says, well, just get over it. It's not logically inconsistent, no matter how absurd it seems. But then when you have something like the Grim Reaper paradox, where it is logically impossible, then he dismisses it as a logical inconsistency. I don't think you can have it both ways.
Why is that? Can you explain that a little bit deeper? Why can't he have it both ways?
Well, because on the one hand, he's saying that if it's not logically inconsistent, just get over it. There's no problem. But then with Proust shows that it does result in a logical inconsistency. And then he says it's not a problem because it's a logical impossibility. Well, actually, it makes you wonder, why couldn't you say that to someone who shows a logical impossibility? Suppose somebody demonstrates that it's a contradiction, and your response to that is just get over it. So what if it's a logical contradiction? Get over it. That kind of dismissive response just doesn't come to grips with the question, is this really metaphysically possible?
Have you heard of the unsatisfiable pair diagnosis?
No.
Okay, it's one of the responses that Alex Malpass has developed in response to these Messenger and Reaper paradoxes. Really, like I said, it's really interesting stuff. There's been, that's like cutting edge, extreme cutting edge. And Proust talks about this objection in his book as well, Infinity Paradox, and I can't remember the full name of the title, but it really fun stuff. Philosophically, like, this is just stuff that I love to think about. But anyways, go watch that debate. Let's get into the last clip here on the moral argument.
Next up, we have, I humbly state, the most eye-rolling argument of them all. Thanks again, Craig. The moral argument goes like this. If God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. Premise 2, objective moral values do exist. Conclusion, therefore, God exists.
All right, let's stop it here.
Objections.
He has at least, again, correctly formulated the argument as I've presented it, that if there is no God, if atheism is true, then objective moral values and duties don't exist. But objective moral values and duties do in fact exist, and therefore it follows logically that God exists. This is a valid argument, and so the only question is whether or not the premises are true.
Well, we could take the anti-realist position and simply state, no, objective moral values and duties do not exist, and in doing so, reject premise 2. Get over it, bucko. Or, if you believe that morality is objective, you can do this.
Okay, let's hold it here. Here we got the get over it objection again. Just adopt moral nihilism. That's all right. Just say there are no objective moral values and duties. There's nothing really immoral about murdering and raping a little girl. That's just fine. And I wonder, does Stephen really believe that? Or is he just, maybe he is just playing games. He says he's just having fun. The question is, right, which is more plausible, that premise 2 is true or that moral nihilism is true? And I think the vast majority of people who have thought about this seriously would say that there are some objective moral values and duties. Some things are genuinely morally evil. And if you hold that, then you will agree with premise 2. And it's just too facile to say, get over it to the moral nihilist.
What I wanted to ask you was, what are your thoughts on the argument from epistemic realism to moral realism? The idea that you've got these epistemic virtues that pretty much everyone, including skeptics, agree that these are sort of binding. Like, you've got to avoid these intellectual vices. You've got to avoid cognitive bias. You've got to avoid... there's all of these different things that you've got to do epistemic wise, but then if you've got these obligations epistemically, then it seems to, like, you can just draw an immediate connection between epistemic duties and moral duties. What do you think about a defense of the second premise based on something like that?
Oh yeah, I think that's great, Cameron. That's not something I've done. I've tried to think in more practical terms of the kind of moral values and duties that most of us encounter in everyday moral experience. in our interactions with other people. But you're quite right in pointing out that if there are epistemic duties like to be unbiased, to reason logically, to marshal your evidence carefully, to not distort the views of those that you criticize, well, then if you recognize those epistemic virtues, you are committed to the objectivity of moral values and duties.
All right, let's continue through the video here. He's got Euthyphro dilemma up on the screen. I'm sure we'll talk about that.
Euthyphro. Socrates asked Euthyphro, is the pious loved by the gods because it is pious, or is it pious because it is loved by the gods? Or in other words, is something morally good loved by God because it's morally good, or is it morally good simply because God says so? Well, if it's morally good just because God says so, the morality is not morality at all. It's might makes right. That's it. It's about whether or not you can live up to the arbitrary whims of this celestial dictator. That's not morality. Not at all. However, on the other hand, if they say that it's morally good in and of itself, then morality obviously supersedes God, and thus we can reject the first premise.
All right, this is one of the oldest and most tired arguments against God as the foundation of moral values. The Euthyphro dilemma is not a dilemma of the form A or not A. It doesn't offer mutually exclusive alternatives. It's of the form A or B. And to escape the horns of the dilemma, all you have to do is offer a third alternative, C. And in fact, that's what the theist does here. The theist will say basically what Plato said, namely that God is the good, and that God is the paradigm of goodness. Robert Adams, who is the preeminent ethicist that has defended this sort of view, calls it theistic Platonism. God is what Plato called the good, and therefore things are good insofar as they resemble God, who is the paradigm of goodness. And this is a perfectly rational, and I would say extremely plausible solution to this pseudo-dilemma posed by Euthyphro.
I like that you call it a pseudo-dilemma. Well, that's it. That's everything. Do you have any other thoughts on the video as a whole, or should we go into some questions now?
Well, I'm impressed that he's interacting with the arguments. I think that's really good, but he needs to interact with the arguments as formulated and defended by their proponents, and not with cheap caricatures of the argument, such as he did with the ontological argument and the argument from contingency.
Fair enough. I think that's a very good critique. All right, let's get into some questions. So the first question that we had, this wasn't a question at all. It was actually just a super chat that was sent in by Maverick Christian. He says, first. That's all he says. And then we have another one from Maverick Christian, and this one is actually about his own work. He's got this published. He says, ever hear of the eternal society paradox? It's totally awesome in my completely unbiased opinion. And the reason why he says that again is because he's actually published on it.
Okay, no, I've not heard of this.
It's a version of the messenger paradox, and just it's in different terms.
So it's attempting to show there cannot be an infinite causal chain.
Correct. Yeah, it's an argument for causal finitism.
Yeah, very good. Proust's own book is just full of illustrations of this nature. And they're really fun to think about. You begin to think of what it would be like to have an actually infinite number of things or sequence of causes, and all sorts of really counterintuitive and even contradictory situations emerge.
All right, so Chad McIntosh, the guy that we mentioned earlier, did we mention him? I can't remember if we talked about him before the stream, but he's
exactly.
He sent in a live chat.
Chad in the conversation before the podcast.
Yeah, I was mentioning that we did an entire 4.5 hour show with Chad, and he laid out 150 plus different arguments for the existence of God, different versions of these arguments. He looked through the peer-reviewed literature and found all of these different versions, and we put them up on the screen. We talked about them for a little bit. 4.5 hours long. I highly recommend going and checking out that stream. And then here he is. He sent in a super chat for Dr. Craig. He says, everything has a cause. The straw man that will not die. There's even a logic text from the 1880s that complains about it. Say it with me. Get over it. That's pretty clever. All right. So here's another question from Jojo Freelancer KUP. Pull it up on the screen here. What did God, and I think English may not be their first language, so I'll just read it exactly how they have it here. What did God before the creation? If God is eternal past, how did God start the creation? Did he always create? And are there versions that God is out of space and time?
Well, this is a very profound question about the relationship between God and time. I've written several books on this, including a popular level book called Time and Eternity. And I would recommend this to Jojo. My studied position is that God is timeless without creation. God existing alone is changeless and therefore timeless. At the moment of creation, God exercises his causal power to bring the universe into being. And so the first moment of time is the moment at which God exercises his creative power and at which the universe springs into existence. And I would say, in virtue of that change in God, in virtue of that relation with the temporal universe, God enters into time at the moment of creation, so that God is temporal since the moment of creation. So the view that I've defended is a very odd one, but I think it's coherent, and that is that God is timeless without the universe and temporal since the moment of creation.
So we just had a super chat come in just now, and I'm going to put it up on the screen so we can get rid of it really quickly. Can or will you grow your beard back?
No. Well, I can, but I won't. I mean,
there you go. Okay. This one is from Venerage. He says, is Dr. Craig aware of Paul Draper's upcoming book in 2023 on the problem of suffering? It's going to be his magnum opus. Will Dr. Craig respond to it?
I don't know that I'll respond to it because I'm currently working on a systematic philosophical theology that occupies me full time during the workday. And so if this is not on topic, I'll probably not be interacting with it. Fortunately, there are plenty of other fine Christian philosophers who have worked on the problem of evil who probably will.
Amen. All right. James Rivera says, what are Craig's thoughts on Kuhn's objection to God being the good, namely that it pushes the dilemma a step back?
Yeah, I think this is just completely misconceived. There is no further meta dilemma once you say that God is the good, he is the paradigm of goodness, and that therefore finite things are good insofar as they resemble God. There just isn't any further dilemma to be pushed.
Okay, here's another question sent in by Maverick Christian. He says, have you heard someone argue both premises of the moral argument are false? I noticed you can derive a contradiction from both premises being false in propositional logic.
I think that sometimes people inconsistently vacillate between the two. I mean, even in the video we looked at today with Stephen, he didn't really make it clear what his position actually is on the moral argument. Does he deny the truth of premise 2 or premise 1? And so it's sometimes hard to get people to come clean on this, and they will jump back and forth. I remember one conversation I had with one fellow when we would talk about premise 1, he would agree with it but deny premise 2. But then when we talk about premise 2, he'd agree with it and deny premise 1. And so it's almost, it would be funny if it weren't so serious, but I wouldn't be surprised if some people just affirm contradictions with respect to this out of a desperation to avoid the conclusion.
Okay, so just a couple more questions and then we're going to close it out. So this one from Tony XXD. Do you agree with evolution?
That depends on how you define the word. You see, evolution is a kind of accordion word that can be expanded and contracted with the context of use. In the broadest sense of the word, evolution means descent with modification. And of course, I believe in that. Every young earth creationist believes in evolution in that sense because he believes that all human beings are descended from a single human pair. And yet, look at the enormous differences between, say, an Australian Aborigine and a fair-skinned Laplander. Clearly, there's been descent with modification among living animals and organisms. If you mean that all living organisms are descended from a common ancestor, I'm skeptical about that. It seems to me that we don't have any good evidence for a monophyletic origin of life. The evidence is consistent with phyla originating independently of each other, even though there would be a good amount of common descent within certain biological orders. As for the explanatory mechanisms of evolutionary change, like random mutation and natural selection, I think that within the community of evolutionary biologists, there's a great deal of skepticism about the adequacy of those evolutionary mechanisms. And the cutting edge of evolutionary theory today is to talk about additional mechanisms. For example, heritable characteristics that could be the result of non-genetic factors as the organism matures embryotically. I think that the theory is still under development, and I'm open-minded to it. I'm open to being convinced by the evidence.
Okay, so here's a question from Harrison Kunha. I'm hoping I'm pronouncing that correctly. Any thoughts on inflation before the Big Bang?
I would say that if there is inflation before the Big Bang, it cannot be extended into the past infinitely. This was the startling implication of the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem. Inflationary models of the universe were developed that could be future eternal. Inflation would go on forever into the future. And the question arose, could this also be extrapolated infinitely into the past? And what the Borde-Guth-Vilenkin theorem showed is that that's not, in fact, possible. So I don't think that there's any hope for saying that this restores a past eternal universe.
Okay, so Venerage has sent in another super chat, and he says, he or she, could Dr. Craig convince Alexander Proust to come on Capturing Christianity? We all want for it to happen. The answer is no.
Well,
I'll answer for
really,
you.
Cameron?
Yeah,
he won't do it.
I've talked to him on a number of occasions, and it's just, the reason why he doesn't do it is because it's just not his thing. And I completely understand, like, it's just not his thing, you know?
I do too. Alex Proust is sort of like a thinking machine, and I think his social skills might be such that he wouldn't feel real comfortable doing a podcast with Cameron.
Yeah, it's just not his thing, and he does a lot of other great work, and so we just got to benefit from him in the way that we can. Which he does.
Exactly.
I mean, go.
His published work is out there.
And go look at his blog. His blog is insane. It's crazy. He posts, like, I think almost once a day. He's even got like a backlog, according to other people. He's got a backlog of posts and stuff that are going to come out, and they're all just like every single one every day is just mind blowing. He's always putting out new content. Always, you can always glean from his work. So every single day, go and check it out. Okay, so this is a really good question. We've only got a few more minutes from CJ. Barrel. How do I start learning philosophy and theology? I haven't read any of the early philosophers or church fathers yet. Should I start with them?
No, definitely not. Do not start there. I would say theologically, what you need to do is get a good book on basic Christian doctrine. And one that I recommend is by Bruce Milne, Milne. It's called Know the Truth. And it's a very nice survey of basic Christian doctrine. Or you could just work through the lectures of my Defenders class, which are available at reasonablefaith.org, and that will give you a survey of the whole body of Christian theology. Philosophically, you might want to take a look at J.P. Moreland and my book, Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview, which is a sort of introduction to philosophy from a Christian perspective.
All right, I'm going to need your help with this next question. I don't know if you can read it on the screen here. I read your last book. I'm curious if you have any pushback on Homo heidelbergensis? How do you say that?
Heidelbergensis.
Homo heidelbergensis. Heidelbergensis, being an ancestor.
Or
many think it is not even... Go ahead.
Or you can just call him Heidelberg man.
Heidelberg
this is the
man.
Latin
Okay.
species name, like Homo sapiens, but Heidelberg man is what we're talking about. He was the ancestral human of both Homo sapiens, ourselves, and Neanderthals.
So her question is, Slam RN, she's one of our moderators. She says, many think it's not even a real species that lived. If that's true, how would that affect your model?
Whether or not it should be classified as a separate species is irrelevant. These species classifications are artificial. They're invented by biologists for these different human beings. The question is, did he actually live? Were there human beings like this? What was their brain capacity? What sort of modern cognitive behaviors did they exhibit? And so it's neither here nor there whether you class this as a separate species or simply some other early human form that was ancestral to us. The point is that such a person, such human beings actually did exist. We have good archaeological and paleontological evidence of their reality, and I think we have good evidence for their modern cognitive capacities as well.
From Cedric, he says, love you both. Question for Dr. Craig. Have you seen any promising advances on the multiverse theory of late?
No, but I have to say that this isn't something that I'm working on right now. As I say, I'm writing this systematic philosophical theology. And so what I've been studying is, first of all, what is systematic theology? What is philosophical theology? Then the doctrine of Scripture, then the doctrine of faith. What is faith and how is faith justified? And then finally, a very large section on the doctrine of God, going through the various attributes of God. And this has been, for me, a sort of magnificent obsession that is taking all of my time. So I haven't been following current cosmology closely at all.
Fair enough. All right, so here's the last question that's going to do it for us today. Another one from Venerage. Is Dr. Craig aware of Skydive Phil's documentary?
Yes, thank you very much. Responding to this documentary, and I have also written 4 questions of the week responding to the documentary. And what I show, I think, is that although he has interviewed some very impressive physicists and philosophers, that the argument is misrepresented to these gentlemen so that their criticisms are largely aimed at straw men. The video also includes a couple of red herrings that are simply a waste of time because they're not relevant to the argument. And finally, the scientific information in the video is simply a rehash of old material that James Sinclair and I have already responded to. So although the video appears at first to be very impressive, at the end of the day, I think it proves to be disappointing, and it doesn't really succeed in advancing the debate.
The section that I watched on the thermodynamics, that section seemed particularly weak to me. Did it seem the same to you?
Well, what was especially disturbing to me about that is that they criticize Aaron Wall's thermodynamic theorem based on the generalized second law of thermodynamics, and they never bothered to go and interview Aaron Wall about it. And it just shows the tendentiousness of this video. It's clearly a polemical piece which has been scripted in advance, and then you go out and get the clips you need to make your case. But they never went and talked to Aaron Wall about his theorem. I did. I contacted him and said, what about this objection that it's only in an infinite universe that you have an initial finite, or an initial cosmological singularity? And I share Aaron Wall's correspondence with me on this, both in my question of the week and in the podcast recorded with Kevin, which shows that the criticism was, in fact, misplaced.
Ooh, I'm really excited about this. You just got me way too excited. Yeah, that's I saw it too, and it was a good video. It was really, really well produced. I thought it was very beautiful and everything, and so it was great.
Yeah, they must have spent tens of thousands of dollars to do this, to travel and interview these men. But as I say, in the end, I think that the result is disappointing.
Well, in any case, thank you so much for coming on today. This has been a pleasure. It's been a blast. It's always great to have you on the show. So thanks for joining me, and we will see you guys in the next Capturing Christianity video very, very soon.
Okay.
So
thank you.
See you guys later.
Cameron.